Billionaire took his daughter to the doctor and discovered that the pediatrician was his ex-fiancée. The thermometer read 104.2 degrees, and Alexander Hale knew this wasn't something chamomile tea could fix. He stood in the marble-floored foyer of his Beacon Hill mansion, watching his 3-year-old daughter Emma shiver beneath her favorite unicorn blanket. Her usually bright hazel eyes were glassy, unfocused, and her small hand felt like fire against his palm. For a man who had built a pharmaceutical empire worth billions, Alexander had never felt more helpless than in this moment, holding his burning child. "Daddy's tired," Emma whispered, her voice barely audible above the grandfather clock's steady ticking. "I know, sweetheart. We're going to see a doctor, okay?" He lifted her carefully, feeling how her tiny body seemed to radiate heat through the soft cotton of her pajamas. The weight of her trust pressed against his chest, heavier than any board meeting, more demanding than any hostile takeover. Alexander had learned to navigate boardrooms filled with sharks, to make decisions that affected thousands of employees, to turn failing companies into gold mines. But 3 years and 8 months of single fatherhood had taught him that nothing, absolutely nothing, compared to the terror of a sick child. He grabbed his keys from the crystal bowl by the door, the same bowl that had once held engagement rings and wedding plans. Now it held car keys, Emma's hair ties, and the fragments of a life he'd had to rebuild from scratch. The drive to Boston Children's Pediatric Clinic took 23 minutes through the winding streets of Cambridge. Alexander counted every red light, every slow-moving SUV ahead of them. In the rearview mirror, he watched Emma's reflection, her small face pale against the leather car seat. "Tell me the story about the princess again, Daddy," she murmured, her eyes fluttering closed. Alexander's throat tightened. The princess story, the one about a beautiful woman with green eyes who lived in a castle made of stethoscopes and band-aids. He'd created it during Emma's first fever, when she was barely 2 years old and asking why some kids had mommies and she didn't. He never expected that fictional princess to become so real, so painful to tell. "Once upon a time," he began, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest, "there was a princess who could heal anyone with just her smile." The clinic's parking lot was nearly empty at 7:43 a.m. Alexander had called ahead, using the influence that money and desperation could buy. Dr. Whitmore, their usual pediatrician, was out of town, but the receptionist had assured him that Dr. Monroe, their most experienced pediatrician, would see Emma immediately. Monroe. The name had registered somewhere in the back of his mind, but Alexander's focus had been entirely on getting Emma the care she needed. Names were just words when your child was burning up with fever. The waiting room smelled like disinfectant and childhood fears. Colorful murals of jungle animals decorated the walls, but Alexander barely noticed them. He paced the small space, Emma limp in his arms when the nurse finally called them back. "Room 7, Mr. Hale. Dr. Monroe will be right with you." Alexander settled Emma onto the examination table, pulling the paper cover around her small form. She looked so fragile against the sterile white, like a flower wilting in winter. He checked his watch. 8:15 a.m. In another life, he would have been reviewing quarterly reports by now, drinking his third espresso, planning his day around profit margins and market analysis. Now his world revolved around goldfish crackers, picture books, and the terrifying responsibility of keeping another human being safe and loved. The door handle turned with a soft click, and Alexander looked up, expecting to see a stranger, some competent doctor who would fix his daughter and send them home with antibiotics and reassurance. Instead, his entire universe stopped. She stood in the doorway like a ghost made flesh, her white coat pristine, her dark brown hair pulled back in a way that revealed the elegant line of her neck. But it was her eyes, those deep green eyes that had haunted his dreams for 3 years and 8 months, that confirmed what his heart already knew. Isabel Monroe stood frozen, her hand still on the door handle, her lips parted in the beginning of a greeting that would never come. And in that moment, Alexander realized that some mistakes don't just change your life, they lie dormant, waiting for the perfect moment to detonate and reshape everything you thought you knew about love, loss, and second chances. Time moved like honey in that sterile room, thick, slow, and suffocating. Isabel's clipboard slipped from her fingers, clattering against the linoleum floor with a sound that seemed to echo through every unspoken word between them. Her green eyes, the same ones that had looked at him with such love and devastating disappointment 3 years and 8 months ago, now held something else entirely. Shock, pain, and the carefully constructed walls of a woman who had learned to survive heartbreak. She started, her voice catching like a bird with a broken wing. I didn't know. Alexander felt Emma shift in his arms, her small hand reaching toward the sound. Even in her fever-induced haze, his daughter seemed drawn to Isabel's voice. Soft, musical, the kind of voice that belonged in bedtime stories and whispered promises. Dr. Monroe, he managed, his businessman's training kicking in despite the earthquake happening inside his chest. This is Emma. She's been running a high fever since yesterday evening. Professional, clinical, safe. But Isabel wasn't looking at him anymore. Her gaze had shifted to the small girl in his arms, and Alexander watched something extraordinary happen to her face. The defensive walls cracked, just slightly, as she took in Emma's flushed cheeks, her labored breathing, her tiny fingers clutching a stuffed elephant. "Hello, sweet girl," Isabel whispered, stepping closer. Her voice had transformed into the gentle tone Alexander remembered her using with the neighborhood kids, back when they'd walk through Boston Common on Sunday mornings, planning their future family. "I'm Dr. Bell. Can you tell me how you're feeling?" Emma lifted her head weakly, studying Isabel with the unfiltered curiosity that only 3-year-olds possessed. "Pretty," she murmured, then buried her face back against Alexander's shoulder. The word hung in the air like a bridge between past and present. Alexander felt Isabel's eyes flick to his face for just a moment, a flash of something vulnerable and raw, before she moved into doctor mode. "Let's get her on the examination table," Isabel said, her hands gentle as she helped Alexander transfer Emma to the crinkly paper surface. "When did the fever start exactly?" "Around 6 yesterday evening. It spiked during the night. I've been giving her children's Tylenol every 4 hours, but—" Alexander's voice trailed off as he watched Isabel's hands. The same hands that had once traced patterns on his chest during lazy Sunday mornings, now checking Emma's lymph nodes with practiced precision. "Any other symptoms? Cough, runny nose, ear pain?" "She complained about her throat yesterday, but she's been too sleepy to eat much since then." Alexander found himself studying Isabel's profile, the way she'd always bitten her lower lip when concentrating. Some things never changed. Isabel placed her stethoscope against Emma's chest, her movements careful and sure. "Deep breaths for me, sweetheart. Can you breathe like a dragon? Big dragon breaths?" Emma managed a small smile, the first one Alexander had seen since the fever started. She attempted a tiny dragon breath, and Isabel smiled back. A real smile, not the polite doctor smile she'd been wearing like armor. "Perfect dragon," Isabel praised, moving the stethoscope to different positions. "Your daddy must be very proud of such a brave dragon." "Daddy tells me princess stories," Emma whispered, her eyes growing heavy again. "About a princess with green eyes like yours." The stethoscope paused against Emma's back. Alexander felt the blood drain from his face as Isabel's gaze snapped to his, sharp and questioning. He'd never told her about the princess stories, never mentioned how he'd turned her memory into fairy tales for their daughter. Their daughter. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Emma wasn't Isabel's daughter, but in this moment, watching Isabel's gentle care, seeing the natural way she interacted with the little girl, Alexander could almost pretend that this was how it was supposed to be. "Does she now?" Isabel's voice was carefully neutral, but Alexander caught the slight tremor beneath the professional facade. She continued her examination, checking Emma's ears, throat, and temperature again. "It looks like strep throat," she announced after several minutes of careful assessment. "We'll need to do a quick test to confirm, but the symptoms are classic. Nothing serious, but she'll need antibiotics and plenty of rest." Relief flooded through Alexander's chest. Not serious, just strep throat. Something fixable, something that wouldn't require the kind of helpless watching that had terrified him since becoming a father. "The test will just take a few minutes," Isabel continued, preparing a throat swab. "Emma, can you open your mouth really wide like a lion? Show me your big lion roar." As Emma complied with weak enthusiasm, Alexander found himself mesmerized by the way Isabel moved, confident, caring, completely in her element. This was the woman he'd fallen in love with, the one who'd dreamed of having children of her own, of building a family together. The woman he'd lost because of one night, one mistake, one moment of weakness that had cost him everything. "All done, brave girl," Isabel said, labeling the swab. "I'll be right back with the results." She moved toward the door, but Alexander's voice stopped her. "Isabel." She turned, and for a moment the professional mask slipped completely. He saw the woman who had loved him, who had planned their wedding, who had cried in his arms the night she'd walked away. "Thank you," he said simply. For taking care of her. Isabel's hand tightened on the door handle. It's my job, Alexander. But they both knew it was so much more than that. The silence that followed Isabel's exit felt like holding your breath underwater. Necessary for survival, but impossible to maintain forever. Alexander sat in the plastic chair beside the examination table, watching Emma's chest rise and fall in the rhythm of exhausted sleep. Her fever had broken slightly, leaving her cheeks less flushed but still warm to his touch. In the fluorescent lighting of the medical room, she looked even smaller than usual. Her dark hair, so much like his own, spread across the paper pillow like spilled ink. The clock on the wall ticked loudly. 9:17 a.m. In his previous life, he would have been chairing the weekly executive meeting, reviewing the quarterly projections for Hale Genix's new pediatric division. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd built an empire creating medicines for children, yet felt completely powerless when his own child needed help. Isabel had been gone for exactly 12 minutes. He knew because he'd been counting, the way he used to count the seconds between lightning and thunder during the storms that used to send her running into his arms. Some habits died harder than love, apparently. The door opened with that same soft click, and she returned carrying a tablet and a small white bag that rustled with each step. Her professional mask was firmly back in place, but Alexander had known her well enough once to recognize the tiny furrow between her eyebrows that appeared when she was processing something difficult. The test confirmed strep throat, she said, settling into the rolling stool across from him. Even sitting, she maintained perfect posture, spine straight, shoulders back, chin lifted slightly. It was the same confidence she'd carried when she'd walked out of his life, dignity intact despite the tears streaming down her face. Amoxicillin, twice daily for 10 days. She continued, pulling a pink bottle from the bag. Bubblegum flavored. Most children tolerate it well. She likes strawberry better, Alexander found himself saying, then immediately regretted the intimacy of the detail. It revealed too much, that he knew his daughter's preferences, that he paid attention to the small things, that he'd become the kind of father he'd never expected to be. Isabel's fingers paused on the prescription bottle. I can call in a strawberry prescription to the pharmacy if you prefer. That would be... He stopped, studying her face. There was something different in her expression, something softer than the clinical distance she'd been maintaining. That would be very kind of you. Emma stirred on the table, her hazel eyes opening slowly. She looked around the room with the disorientation of fever dreams, her gaze settling on Isabel with immediate recognition. Dragon Lady, she whispered, a small smile tugging at her lips. That's Dr. Bell, sweetheart, Alexander corrected gently. But Isabel was already smiling. The first genuine, unguarded smile he'd seen from her in almost 4 years. Dragon Lady works too, Isabel said, moving closer to the examination table. How are you feeling, brave dragon? Better, Emma said, though her voice was still weak. Can you tell me a story? Daddy's stories are about princesses, but I like dragons too. Alexander felt his heart stop. Emma had never asked anyone but him for stories before. She was a shy child, cautious around strangers, protective of her small world that consisted mainly of him, their housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, and her beloved books. Mrs. Chen. He winced internally, realizing he'd have to call her soon to explain why he wouldn't be in the office today. Another piece of his carefully constructed life, disrupted by this unexpected collision with his past. Well, Isabel said, settling onto the edge of her stool, there once was a little dragon who lived in a magical forest. As Isabel spun a tale about a dragon who could heal sick forest animals with her warm breath, Alexander found himself transported back to their Sunday mornings in his old apartment on Marlborough Street. Isabel would curl up in his bed, stealing his MIT sweatshirt, making up stories about the couples they saw walking their dogs in the public garden. She'd always been a natural storyteller, weaving magic from ordinary moments. And the little dragon learned that sometimes the best magic isn't breathing fire, Isabel was saying, her voice gentle and melodic, but breathing kindness onto the people who need it most. Emma's eyes had grown heavy again, but she was fighting sleep to hear the end of the story. What happened to the dragon's mommy? She asked suddenly, the question hanging in the air like a loaded gun. Alexander felt his chest tighten. Emma asked about mothers sometimes. Not often, but enough to remind him of everything she'd lost before she was even born, everything he couldn't give her no matter how hard he tried. Isabel's eyes flicked to Alexander for just a moment, and he saw something pass across her face. Understanding, pain, and something else he couldn't quite identify. The little dragon's mommy became a star, she said softly, her voice carrying the kind of wisdom that came from her own losses. She watches over her baby dragon from the sky, making sure she's always safe and loved. And even though the mommy dragon can't be there to tell bedtime stories or kiss scraped knees, her love is still there, wrapped around the little dragon like the warmest blanket in the world. Emma nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation in the way that children accept difficult truths when they're delivered with love and certainty. "Dr. Bell?" Emma whispered, her eyes closing. "Will you be here when I wake up?" The question seemed to surprise Isabel as much as it did Alexander. She looked at him, and for a moment, the professional boundaries dissolved completely. He saw the woman who had once dreamed of moments exactly like this, caring for a child, being needed, being part of something bigger than herself. She began, then seemed to gather herself. "I have other patients to see, sweetheart. But your daddy will be right here and he'll take very good care of you." Emma nodded, already drifting back to sleep, but her next words were clear despite her drowsiness. "I wish you could be my dragon lady forever." The silence that followed was deafening, filled with all the things they couldn't say, all the dreams that had died, and all the impossible wishes that still lived in the space between what was and what could have been. Emma's innocent wish echoed in the sterile room like a prayer whispered in an empty church, heard by God but unanswered. Isabel stood frozen beside the examination table, her hand still extended from tucking the blanket around Emma's sleeping form. Alexander watched her face cycle through a dozen emotions in the span of heartbeats: longing, pain, professional composure, and something that looked dangerously close to hope. "She doesn't understand what she's saying," Alexander said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. It was meant to be reassurance, for Isabel, for himself, for the fragile peace they were trying to maintain. But the words felt like stones in his mouth, heavy and wrong. "Children often say exactly what they mean," Isabel replied, her fingers lingering on the edge of Emma's blanket. "They haven't learned to lie to themselves yet." The observation cut deeper than Alexander expected. How many lies had he told himself over the past 3 years and 8 months? That he was fine alone, that Emma was enough, that he'd moved on from the woman standing 3 feet away from him, so close he could smell her familiar perfume, something soft and floral that reminded him of the jasmine that used to grow outside his bedroom window. "Isabel," he began, but she was already moving toward her tablet, fingers flying across the screen with practiced efficiency. "I'm sending the strawberry amoxicillin prescription to the CVS on Boylston Street," she said, her voice returning to its professional cadence. "You should be able to pick it up within the hour. Emma needs to take it with food and make sure she completes the full course even if she starts feeling better." "I know," Alexander said, then caught himself. "I mean, I'll make sure she does." But Isabel had already noticed his slip. Her green eyes sharpened, taking in details she'd been too shocked to process before. The way he held Emma with practiced ease, the diaper bag slung over his shoulder that was clearly well used, the small stain on his expensive shirt that spoke of countless breakfast struggles and bedtime routines. "You've been doing this alone," she said. It wasn't a question. Alexander's jaw tightened. This was the conversation he'd dreaded, the one that would force him to explain the unexplainable, to justify the unjustifiable. "Emma's mother died during childbirth. I've been her only parent since she was born." The clinical facts, safe, distant, they didn't capture the terror of those first nights when Emma wouldn't stop crying, the way he'd called his own mother at 2 a.m. begging for advice, the countless pediatric books he'd read until his eyes burned. They didn't explain how a man who'd built his fortune on logic and strategy had learned to navigate the emotional minefield of raising a daughter who looked at him with complete trust. "I'm sorry," Isabel said, and her voice carried the weight of genuine grief, not just for the woman who had died, but for the complications that death had created, for the child who would grow up without a mother, for the man who had been thrust into single parenthood under such tragic circumstances. "Don't," Alexander said sharply, then immediately regretted his tone. Emma stirred slightly at the sound, and he lowered his voice. "Don't apologize. You didn't know. You couldn't have known." But that wasn't entirely true, and they both knew it. Isabel could have known if she'd wanted to. In a city like Boston, among their shared social and professional circles, news of Alexander Hale becoming a single father wouldn't have stayed secret long. The fact that she didn't know meant she'd actively avoided information about him, had cut him out of her life so completely that even major life changes didn't reach her. The realization should have hurt less after all this time, but it didn't. "She's beautiful," Isabel said quietly, her gaze returning to Emma's sleeping face. She has your eyes, but there's something else. Something gentle that's all her own. She gets that from reading, Alexander found himself saying. She loves books. Stories about dragons and princesses and magical forest where everything turns out right in the end. Like the princess stories you tell her, the ones about someone with green eyes. Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks. He'd forgotten how direct Isabel could be when she wanted the truth. It started as a way to help her sleep. She was having nightmares when she was 2, and I thought if I gave her something beautiful to think about, you turned me into a fairy tale. I turned the memory of us into something that could help her. The honesty surprised him. He hadn't meant to reveal so much, but sitting in this room with Isabel, watching her gentle care for his daughter, the walls he'd built around his heart felt paper-thin. Isabel was quiet for a long moment, processing this information. Outside the room, the clinic hummed with normal activity. Phones ringing, children laughing, the soft squeak of sneakers on linoleum. But inside room 7, time felt suspended, held in place by all the things they weren't saying. Does she ask about her mother? Isabel finally asked. Sometimes. I tell her the truth in ways she can understand, that her mother loved her very much but couldn't stay. That love doesn't always mean being present, but it's always real. That's very wise. I learned it from someone who taught me that love is more complicated than I thought. Alexander looked directly at her for the first time since she'd entered the room. Someone who showed me that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is walk away. Isabel's breath caught, her professional composure cracking just enough to reveal the pain underneath. Alexander, don't. Don't what? Don't acknowledge what happened between us? Don't admit that I think about that night every single day? Don't say that losing you was the worst mistake I ever made? Emma shifted on the examination table, murmuring something in her sleep that sounded like dragon. Both adults immediately focused on her, using her presence as an excuse to step back from the dangerous territory they'd been approaching. She needs rest, Isabel said, gathering her tablet and moving toward the door. Lots of fluids, soft foods. The fever should break completely within 24 hours of starting the antibiotic. Isabel, wait. She paused with her hand on the door handle, her back to him. Alexander could see the tension in her shoulders, the careful way she held herself together. Will Emma be able to see you again? For follow-up appointments? The question hung in the air like a bridge neither of them was sure they should cross. Isabel turned slowly, her green eyes meeting his with an expression he couldn't quite read. Do you think that's wise, Alexander? I think, he said carefully, lifting Emma into his arms as she began to wake, that my daughter just asked a dragon lady to stay forever, and I'm not sure I'm strong enough to explain to her why that's impossible. 3 days later, Alexander found himself standing in the same CVS pharmacy where he'd picked up Emma's strawberry-flavored antibiotic, staring at a display of children's vitamins and wondering when his life had become a series of medical decisions. Emma tugged at his hand, her energy finally returning after 2 days of fever-induced lethargy. Daddy, can we get the gummy bears? The dragon lady said I need to eat good things to grow strong. The dragon lady. Emma had mentioned Dr. Bell exactly 17 times since their appointment. Alexander had started counting after the 10th reference. She'd asked when they could visit the dragon lady again, if the dragon lady liked unicorns, and whether the dragon lady would want to see the drawing Emma had made of their story about the healing dragon. We'll see about the vitamins, sweetheart, Alexander said, his attention caught by his phone buzzing with yet another urgent email from his CFO. The pharmaceutical industry didn't pause for strep throat, and his absence from the office hadn't gone unnoticed. Board members were asking questions. Quarterly projections needed his approval, and the FDA was requesting additional data on their latest pediatric trials. But for the first time in his career, Alexander found himself reluctant to dive back into the world of profit margins and corporate strategy. Emma's illness had created a bubble around them, a space where nothing mattered except her temperature, her appetite, and the way she smiled when he read her favorite book about a brave little mouse. Mr. Hale? Alexander turned, recognizing the voice immediately. Isabel stood 3 aisles away, her off-duty clothes, jeans, and a soft gray sweater, making her look younger, more like the woman he'd once known. She held a basket containing what looked like ingredients for soup, and her hair was loose around her shoulders instead of pulled back in its professional ponytail. Dr. Bell! Emma's excitement was immediate and infectious. She dropped Alexander's hand and ran toward Isabel with the fearless enthusiasm that only completely healthy 3-year-olds possessed. Emma, careful, Alexander called, but Isabel was already kneeling to Emma's level, catching her in what could almost be called a hug. "Look how much better you look," Isabel said, her smile genuine and warm. "Your color is perfect, and you're obviously feeling much stronger." "I took all my pink medicine," Emma announced proudly, "and Daddy made me chicken soup, but it wasn't as good as Mrs. Chen's. She makes the best soup in the whole world, but she's visiting her sister in... Emma scrunched her face, trying to remember. "Springfield," Alexander supplied, approaching them with the careful distance of a man trying not to intrude on a moment that felt dangerously intimate. "Our housekeeper is helping her sister move into assisted living." "That's very kind of her," Isabel said, standing slowly. This close, Alexander could see the faint shadows under her eyes as if she hadn't been sleeping well. He wondered if their encounter had affected her as much as it had affected him, if she'd been replaying their conversation in the examination room. "Dr. Bell, do you want to see my dragon picture?" Emma was already digging through Alexander's messenger bag, pulling out the folded paper with the enthusiasm of a child sharing her greatest treasure. The drawing was typical 3-year-old art. Lots of green scribbles that might have been a dragon, stick figures that could have been people, and what appeared to be a building with windows. But Emma had spent an hour working on it, her tongue poking out in concentration, asking Alexander repeatedly if he thought the dragon lady would like it. "Oh my," Isabel breathed, accepting the paper with the reverence it deserved. "This is beautiful, Emma. Is this the dragon from our story?" "That's you," Emma said matter-of-factly, pointing to the green scribbles. "And that's me and Daddy. We're all in the castle together and nobody is sick, and we have pancakes for breakfast every day." Alexander felt his chest tighten. In Emma's 3-year-old logic, the castle wasn't just a magical place from a story. It was a home where the people she cared about could all be together. The innocence of her wish hit him like a physical blow. Isabel's fingers trembled slightly as she held the drawing. Would it be okay if I kept this? I could hang it in my office." "Really?" Emma's face lit up like Christmas morning. "You want to keep my picture?" "I would be honored to keep your picture." Alexander watched this exchange with a mixture of gratitude and terror. Emma had never formed attachments this quickly, had never shown such immediate trust in anyone outside their small family circle. But with Isabel, she seemed to open up completely, as if recognizing something familiar and safe. "Emma," Alexander said gently, "we should let Dr. Bell finish her shopping. I'm sure she has things to do." But Emma wasn't ready to end this magical encounter. "Dr. Bell, do you live in a castle? Do you have dragon friends? Do you like pancakes?" Isabel laughed. A real laugh, not the polite sounds she'd made in the clinic. "I live in an apartment. I don't have any dragon friends yet, and I love pancakes, especially the ones with blueberries. Daddy makes good blueberry pancakes," Emma announced. "Maybe you could come have pancakes with us sometime. We have a big table and Mrs. Chen made special placemats with flowers." The invitation hung in the air like a soap bubble, beautiful, fragile, and impossible to sustain. Alexander felt his face flush as he watched Isabel process Emma's words, saw the longing and fear war across her features. "That's very sweet of you to invite me," Isabel said carefully, "but I'm sure your daddy has very busy mornings." "Actually," Alexander heard himself saying, "Saturday mornings are usually pretty quiet. If you'd like to join us for pancakes, you'd be welcome." The words surprised him as much as they seemed to surprise Isabel. He hadn't planned to extend the invitation, hadn't thought through the implications of having her in his home at his breakfast table, sitting in the space where Emma's mother should have been, but looking at his daughter's hopeful face, at the way she clutched Isabel's hand like she was afraid the dragon lady might disappear, Alexander realized that some invitations weren't about logic or planning. They were about recognizing that the people we love, even the people we've lost, sometimes come back into our lives when we need them most. Isabel began, her green eyes searching his face for something. Permission, maybe, or reassurance that this wasn't as complicated as it felt. "Please, Dr. Bell," Emma asked, her voice carrying the kind of hope that could break hearts or heal them, depending on how carefully it was handled. Isabel looked at Alexander one more time, and in her eyes he saw the same question he'd been asking himself for 3 days. Was it possible to go backward and forward at the same time? Could you revisit the past without destroying the future? "Saturday morning sounds lovely," she said quietly, her voice barely audible over the pharmacy's background music. Emma cheered. Alexander's heart stopped, and somewhere in the fluorescent-lit aisles of a suburban CVS, the impossible began to feel inevitable. Alexander had been awake since 5:30 a.m., which was ridiculous considering Isabel wasn't expected until 9. He stood in his kitchen, surrounded by the evidence of his anxiety. 3 different types of coffee beans he'd ground and reground, a bowl of batter he'd made twice because the first batch seemed too thick, and enough blueberries to feed a small army. The marble countertops of his Beacon Hill kitchen had never seen this much breakfast preparation, not even during the holidays when Mrs. Chen went into full grandmother mode. Emma sat at the kitchen island in her favorite purple pajamas, swinging her legs and watching him with the amused patience of a child who had learned to navigate her father's particular brand of nervous energy. "Daddy, you already cleaned the orange juice glasses 3 times, she observed, her tone carrying the gentle wisdom that sometimes emerged from 3-year-olds when adults were being particularly irrational. "I want everything to be perfect for Dr. Bell," Alexander said, checking the pancake batter consistency again. The truth was more complicated. He wanted everything to be perfect because the last time Isabel had been in his home, she'd left her engagement ring on this same counter and walked out of his life forever. "She already likes us, Daddy. She kept my dragon picture from the mouths of babes." Alexander paused in his frantic preparation, looking at his daughter's serious face. Emma had inherited his analytical mind, but unlike him, she hadn't learned to complicate simple truths with adult fears and regrets. "You're right, sweetheart. Dr. Bell does seem to like us. She likes us a lot," Emma said with the confidence of someone who had never doubted her own lovability. "I can tell because she smiles with her eyes when she looks at me. Mrs. Chen taught me that. She says people who smile with their eyes are the ones who really mean it." Alexander felt something twist in his chest. Mrs. Chen, with her quiet wisdom about reading people, would probably have opinions about Isabel's return to their lives. Opinions he wasn't sure he was ready to hear, even from the woman who had helped him navigate single parenthood with endless patience and surprisingly good advice about everything from teething to tantrums. The doorbell rang at exactly 9 a.m. because of course Isabel would be punctual. She'd always been punctual, even for their first date when she'd shown up at the restaurant 3 minutes early and spent the time people-watching, making up stories about the other diners that had made him laugh until his sides hurt. "Dr. Bell!" Emma scrambled down from her stool and ran toward the front door, her bare feet pattering against the hardwood floors. Alexander followed, his heart doing something complicated in his chest as he watched Emma unlock the door with the careful precision of a child who had been taught about safety but was too excited to remember all the rules. Isabel stood on his doorstep holding a small bouquet of sunflowers and looking like she belonged there, which was impossible considering she'd never actually visited this house. He'd bought it after Emma was born, choosing the family-friendly neighborhood and the large backyard specifically because it was nothing like the sleek downtown condo where he and Isabel had planned their future. "Good morning," she said, her voice carrying only the slightest tremor of nervousness. "I brought flowers for the breakfast table and—" She reached into her purse and pulled out a small wrapped package. "Something for Emma." Emma's eyes went wide. "For me? But it's not my birthday." "Sometimes the best presents happen when it's not your birthday," Isabel said, kneeling to Emma's level. "They're called just because presents." Alexander watched his daughter carefully unwrap the small package, her 3-year-old fingers working methodically to preserve the wrapping paper the way he'd taught her. Inside was a small stuffed dragon, soft and green with kind eyes and a friendly smile. "She looks just like the dragon from our story," Emma breathed, clutching the toy to her chest. "What's her name?" "I thought you might want to name her," Isabel said. "Dragons are very particular about their names. They have to choose the right person to give them one." Emma studied the dragon seriously, then looked up at Isabel with the solemn expression she reserved for very important decisions. "Belle. Her name is Belle, like you." The silence that followed was thick with emotion. Alexander watched Isabel's face cycle through surprise, pleasure, and something that looked dangerously close to tears. "That's a beautiful name," she managed. "Belle the dragon is very lucky to have you as her person." "Come see our kitchen," Emma said, taking Isabel's hand with the casual intimacy of someone who had already decided they were family. "Daddy made so many blueberries we could feed all the dragons in the forest." As they walked through his home, Alexander found himself seeing it through Isabel's eyes. The family photos on the hallway table that chronicled Emma's growth from tiny newborn to chattering toddler, the finger paintings held to the refrigerator with magnets shaped like zoo animals, the comfortable chaos of a house where a child was loved and encouraged to make messes. It was nothing like the perfectly appointed spaces they'd looked at together when they were planning their wedding. Nothing like the minimalist aesthetic they'd both preferred when they were young and child-free and thought they knew what their future would look like. "Your home is beautiful," Isabel said, and Alexander could tell she meant it. "It feels lived in, happy. We like it," Emma announced, climbing back onto her stool at the kitchen island. "Daddy lets me help cook, and we have movie nights in the living room with popcorn and blankets. And when I have bad dreams, I can sleep in his big bed." Alexander felt heat rise in his cheeks. These domestic details felt too intimate to share, too revealing of the man he'd become since Isabel had known him. But Emma had no filter when it came to sharing their life, no understanding that some things were meant to be private. "That sounds perfect," Isabel said, settling onto the stool beside Emma. In her jeans and soft blue sweater, she looked younger, less guarded than she had in the clinical setting. "Can I help with the pancakes?" "Daddy's been making pancakes since before the sun came up," Emma said conspiratorially. "He's nervous because he wants you to like us." "Emma," Alexander warned, but his daughter was just getting started. "He cleaned everything twice, and he kept asking me if the orange juice glasses were clean enough, and he made coffee 3 different ways because he couldn't remember how you like it." Alexander wanted to disappear into the marble floor. "Emma, sweetheart, maybe Dr. Bell doesn't need to know all the details about breakfast preparation." But Isabel was smiling, really smiling, with her eyes the way Emma had described. "I think it's sweet that your daddy wanted everything to be perfect. And for the record, I like my coffee with just a little cream and no sugar. The same way I always did." The phrase hung in the air between them. The same way I always did. It was an acknowledgement of their shared past, a bridge across the years of silence and hurt. Alexander felt something in his chest loosen, just slightly. "I remember," he said quietly, pouring her a cup from the batch he'd made with Ethiopian beans, the kind she'd always preferred on weekend mornings when they had time to savor their coffee instead of grabbing it on the run. As Isabel took her first sip, her eyes closed briefly in what looked like contentment. "Perfect," she said. "Some things never change." But as Alexander began cooking the pancakes, Emma chattering happily about her dragon stories while Isabel listened with genuine attention, he realized that wasn't quite true. Some things never changed, but some things changed everything, and the trick was learning to tell the difference. The pancakes were perfect, golden brown with blueberries that burst sweet and tart against the tongue, but Alexander could barely taste them. He sat across from Isabel at his dining room table, watching her cut Emma's pancakes into small, manageable pieces, with the natural ease of someone who understood children. The morning sunlight streamed through the windows, casting everything in a warm glow that felt almost too perfect, like a scene from one of Emma's storybooks where magical things happen to ordinary families. "These are the best pancakes in the whole world," Emma announced through a mouthful of syrup and blueberries. "Right, Dr. Bell?" "They're absolutely delicious," Isabel agreed, and Alexander could tell by the way she said it that she meant more than just the food. She seemed relaxed here, more at ease than she'd been in the clinic. Her shoulders had lost their rigid professional posture, and she'd laughed 3 times, real laughs that reminded him of Sunday mornings when they used to read the newspaper in bed and make fun of the pretentious restaurant reviews. "Daddy used to make pancakes for his princess," Emma said conversationally, reaching for her orange juice. "In the stories, the princess with green eyes like yours." Alexander felt his fork pause halfway to his mouth. Emma's innocent observations had a way of landing like grenades in the middle of careful conversations. "Did he?" Isabel's voice was carefully neutral, but Alexander caught the slight tightening around her eyes. "Uh-huh. And they would eat them in a big castle with windows everywhere, and the princess would tell the prince about her day helping sick people, and he would tell her about his day, making medicine, to help people too." Emma paused to take a bite, then continued with the matter-of-fact tone of someone recounting established history. "And they were very happy until the prince made a big mistake and the princess had to go away." The silence that followed was deafening. Alexander felt like he couldn't breathe, couldn't think of anything to say that wouldn't make this worse. He'd never told Emma the end of the princess story that way. In his version, the princess had simply gone on a long journey to help other people. But somehow his 3-year-old daughter had intuited the pain underneath the fairy tale. Isabel set down her fork carefully, her gaze fixed on her plate. "That sounds like a very sad story." "It is sad," Emma agreed solemnly. "But Daddy says sometimes sad stories can have happy endings if people are brave enough to try again." Alexander's chest tightened. He'd said those words during one of Emma's bedtime routines, when she'd asked why the princess couldn't just come back. But hearing them repeated now in this context, with Isabel sitting at his table looking like she wanted to flee or cry or both, made him realize how much hope he'd been carrying without acknowledging it. "Emma," he said gently, "maybe we should talk about something else. Dr. Bell didn't come here to hear old stories." But Isabel was looking at Emma with an expression Alexander couldn't quite read. Part wonder, part heartbreak, part something that looked like recognition. "Actually," she said quietly, "I'd like to hear more about the princess, if that's okay." Emma's face lit up. "Oh, she's the most beautiful princess ever. She has magic hands that can make people feel better, and she's very smart, and she loves children more than anything in the whole world. And even though she had to go away, she still lives in the prince's heart, and he tells me about her, so I can love her too." Alexander felt something break open in his chest. Emma's version of the story was so much more generous than the reality, so full of love and forgiveness that he'd never quite managed to feel. Through his daughter's eyes, Isabel wasn't the woman who had walked away. She was the woman who deserved to be remembered, honored, loved, even in absence. "And what happened to the prince?" Isabel asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "He learned how to take care of a little dragon all by himself," Emma said proudly. "And he got really good at making pancakes and reading bedtime stories and braiding hair, even though he's not very good at braids yet. And he waits." "Waits for what?" Emma looked at Isabel with the serious expression she reserved for very important truths. "For the princess to remember that she belongs in the castle too." The words hung in the air like a confession, like a prayer, like everything Alexander had been too afraid to say out loud. He watched Isabel's face cycle through a dozen emotions, saw her hands tremble slightly as she reached for her coffee cup. "Emma," Alexander said, his voice rough with emotion, "that's enough story time for now. Why don't you go get Belle the dragon? I bet Dr. Bell would like to see how you two are getting along." Emma nodded eagerly and slipped down from her chair, her bare feet pattering against the hardwood as she ran toward the living room where she'd left her new toy. Alone with Isabel for the first time since she'd arrived, Alexander felt the weight of everything unsaid pressing down on them like a physical force. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. "I never meant for her to. I didn't realize she understood so much." "Children see things adults miss," Isabel replied, her fingers wrapped around her coffee mug like it was anchoring her to something solid. "They see truth without all the complications we add to it." "And what truth does she see?" Isabel looked up at him then, her green eyes bright with unshed tears. "That you loved me enough to make me the hero of her stories instead of the villain. That you could have told her I abandoned you, abandoned her, but instead you made me into someone she could love. Because that's who you were, who you are." "Alexander," she began, but Emma's return interrupted whatever she had been about to say. "Look," Emma announced, holding up her dragon. "Belle and I already decided we're best friends. She's going to sleep in my bed and come with us to the park and maybe even to my swimming lessons if Daddy says it's okay." "That sounds like a very busy dragon," Isabel said, accepting the toy when Emma held it out for inspection. "She's lucky to have such a good friend. We could all be friends," Emma said with the simple logic of childhood. "You and me and Daddy and Belle the dragon. We could have pancakes every Saturday and go to the park, and maybe you could come to my swimming lessons too. Mrs. Chen says it takes a village to raise a child, and our village is pretty small right now." Alexander felt his heart stop. Emma's innocent invitation contained everything he'd been afraid to want, everything he'd convinced himself was impossible. A family, a second chance, a way to heal the wounds that had never quite stopped bleeding. "What do you think, Doctor?" "Belle?" Emma asked, her voice full of hope and trust and the kind of love that could either save them all or destroy what little piece they'd managed to build. Isabel looked at Alexander over Emma's head, and in her eyes he saw his own longing reflected back at him. Terrifying, powerful, and absolutely undeniable. The question hung in the air like morning mist, visible, delicate, and impossible to grasp without making it disappear. Isabel's fingers tightened around her coffee mug as she looked between Emma's hopeful face and Alexander's careful stillness. The dining room suddenly felt too small, too intimate, too full of possibilities that could either heal old wounds or tear them open wider than before. "I think," she said slowly, choosing each word like stepping stones across a dangerous river, "that sounds like a wonderful village. But sometimes adults need to talk about grown-up things before they can make those kinds of decisions." Emma's face fell slightly, the way children's faces do when they realize the adult world has rules they don't understand. "Are grown-up things boring?" "Not boring," Isabel said, glancing at Alexander. "Just complicated. Mrs. Chen says complicated things get simpler when you tell the truth about them. Emma picked up a blueberry that had escaped from her pancakes, examining it with the focused attention of a scientist. She says lies are what make things complicated. Alexander made a sound that might have been a laugh or a sigh. Mrs. Chen sounds very wise. She is. She taught me how to braid hair and make tea and recognize when people are sad even when they're pretending not to be. Emma looked directly at Isabel with those discerning hazel eyes. You're pretending not to be sad, Dr. Bell. But Mrs. Chen taught me the signs. The observation hit Isabel like a physical blow. She'd spent years perfecting her professional demeanor, learning to compartmentalize her emotions, building walls that could withstand the daily heartbreak of treating sick children. But apparently her defenses were no match for a 3-year-old who had been taught to see past polite pretenses. Sometimes adults have to pretend not to be sad, she said carefully, so they can take care of the people who need them. Like doctors taking care of sick kids? Exactly like that. Emma nodded solemnly, accepting this explanation with the matter-of-fact wisdom that seemed to be her default setting. But you don't have to pretend here. Daddy gets sad sometimes too, especially when he looks at the pictures in his wallet. But he always feels better after we have cuddle time and watch movies with popcorn. Alexander's face flushed red. Emma, I don't think Dr. Bell needs to know about— What pictures? Isabel asked quietly, her professional curiosity overridden by something more personal and urgent. Emma was already sliding down from her chair, running toward the kitchen where Alexander had left his wallet on the counter. I'll show you. Daddy doesn't know I know about them, but I saw them when he was paying for groceries. Emma, no. Alexander started to rise, but she was already back, his leather wallet in her small hands. It's okay, Daddy. Dr. Bell should see. Mrs. Chen says secrets are different from surprises, and secrets usually make people feel bad. With the careful fingers of someone who had been taught to respect other people's belongings, Emma opened the wallet and pulled out a small photograph that had been tucked behind Alexander's credit cards. She held it out to Isabel with the triumph of someone who had solved an important mystery. Isabel's breath caught in her throat. The photo was from their engagement party, taken by Alexander's sister during one of the rare moments when they'd stepped away from their guests. They were standing on the balcony of the country club, Isabel's head on Alexander's shoulder, both of them laughing at something she couldn't remember now. She was wearing the blue dress he'd bought her for her birthday, and her left hand was visible, the engagement ring catching the light. They looked young, happy, completely certain that their future was something they could plan and control. You look like a princess, Emma said, peering at the photo. A real one, not just from stories. Emma, Alexander said, his voice strained. You shouldn't have— It's okay, Isabel said quietly, though it wasn't okay at all. Seeing this photograph, knowing that Alexander had carried it with him all these years, through his relationship with Emma's mother, through single parenthood, through everything, it changed something fundamental about her understanding of their story. There are more, Emma announced, apparently having appointed herself the curator of her father's hidden heartbreak. She pulled out another photo, this one from their weekend in Martha's vineyard, both of them wind-blown and sun-kissed, grinning at the camera with the easy contentment of people in love. Emma, that's enough, Alexander said, but his voice lacked conviction. Maybe some part of him wanted these secrets exposed, wanted Isabel to know that she'd never really left his life even after she'd walked out of it. Why do you keep them if they make you sad? Emma asked, her 3-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of adult contradictions. Alexander was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the photographs in Isabel's hands. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft, honest in a way that made Isabel's chest ache. Because some people are too important to forget, even when remembering hurts. Emma considered this with the seriousness she applied to all adult explanations that didn't quite make sense but felt important anyway. Like how I keep Grandma's bracelet, even though it makes me sad that she's in heaven? Exactly like that. But Dr. Bell isn't in heaven, Emma pointed out with irrefutable 3-year-old logic. She's right here having pancakes with us. So maybe the pictures don't have to make you sad anymore. The simplicity of it was breathtaking. In Emma's world, problems had solutions, hurt had healing, and people who loved each other found ways to be together. She hadn't learned yet that adults could complicate even the most straightforward emotions with pride, fear, and the weight of past mistakes. Isabel looked at the photographs again, then at Alexander, then at Emma, who was watching both of them with the patient attention of someone waiting for adults to catch up to what children already knew. "Can I tell you something, Emma?" Isabel said finally, her voice steady despite the chaos in her heart. "Yes, these pictures, they don't make me sad. They remind me of a time when I was very happy. And seeing them now, knowing that your daddy kept them all this time," she looked directly at Alexander, letting him see the truth in her eyes. "It makes me think that maybe some stories don't have to end the way we thought they did." Emma's face lit up like sunrise. "So the princess could come back to the castle?" "Maybe," Isabel said softly, her gaze never leaving Alexander's face. "If the prince thinks there might still be room for her there." Alexander's response was immediate, certain, carved from years of carrying love like a secret weight. "There's always been room for you, Isabel. The question is whether you're brave enough to come home." Courage, Isabel realized, wasn't the absence of fear. It was the decision to speak truth in spite of it. Alexander's question hung between them like a bridge she could either cross or burn. "Are you brave enough to come home?" The words echoed in the sudden quiet of his dining room, where morning sunlight painted everything golden, and a 3-year-old girl waited for adults to stop complicating what felt simple to her innocent heart. Isabel began, then stopped. The photographs were still in her hands, tangible proof that some loves refused to die even when they should, even when it would be easier. She studied their younger faces, remembering the weight of plans and promises, the certainty they'd both felt about their future. Emma had gone unusually quiet, sensing the gravity of the moment with the intuition that children possessed about adult turning points. She clutched Belle the dragon to her chest, her hazel eyes moving between Isabel and her father like she was watching a tennis match that would determine something important about her world. "The truth is," Isabel said finally, her voice steady despite the earthquake happening in her chest, "I never stopped loving you, Alexander. Not during the worst fight we ever had. Not when I walked away. Not during 3 years and 8 months of pretending I had moved on." Alexander's coffee cup rattled slightly against its saucer as he set it down. "Then why did you leave?" The question she'd been dreading, the one that would require her to excavate the deepest parts of her hurt and examine them in the light of what she knew now. Isabel looked at Emma, who was listening with the focused attention of someone learning important lessons about love and loss. "Because I was 28 years old and I thought love was supposed to be perfect," she said, choosing honesty over self-protection. "I thought if we really belonged together, you wouldn't have been able to be with someone else. Even during our break, I thought true love meant never hurting each other, never making mistakes. And now?" Alexander's voice was careful, hopeful, terrified. "Now I'm 35 and I've spent years watching children face impossible challenges with more grace than I showed when life got complicated." She glanced at Emma, who nodded solemnly, as if she understood exactly what Isabel meant. "I've learned that love isn't about perfection. It's about choosing each other even when things get messy. Especially then." Emma suddenly spoke up, her young voice cutting through the adult complexity with startling clarity. "Mrs. Chen says the best families are the ones that get broken and then fix themselves together. She says the cracks are where the light gets in." Both adults turned to look at her, struck by the wisdom wrapped in her simple words. "Mrs. Chen sounds like a very smart lady," Isabel said softly. "She is, and she says Daddy has been waiting for you to come back, but he was too scared to tell you because grown-ups sometimes think asking for what they want is the same as being selfish." Alexander made a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "Emma, sweetheart, maybe we should let Dr. Bell and Daddy finish their conversation." But Emma wasn't done being the voice of truth in their careful dance around honesty. "Dr. Bell, do you want to be my dragon lady forever? Not just for pancakes and doctor visits, but for real? Like living here and reading me bedtime stories and helping Daddy when he burns the grilled cheese because he gets distracted by work calls?" The question was so direct, so innocent, so full of longing that Isabel felt tears spring to her eyes. This beautiful little girl, who had lost her mother before she could even know what that meant, was offering her heart with the fearless generosity that only children possessed. "Emma," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "that's the most beautiful invitation I've ever received. Is that a yes?" Isabel looked at Alexander, seeing her own fears and hopes reflected in his face. He looked different than he had 4 years ago. Older, yes, but also deeper somehow. Parenthood had carved new lines around his eyes, had taught him patience and selflessness in ways that boardroom battles never could. The man who had made a devastating mistake in a moment of weakness had become someone who could carry that mistake with grace, who could turn his regret into better choices every day. That depends, she said, speaking to Emma but keeping her eyes on Alexander, on whether your daddy thinks there's room in this family for someone who ran away when things got scary, who spent almost 4 years being too proud to admit she made a mistake too. Alexander stood up slowly, moving around the table until he was standing beside her chair. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of every lonely night. Every moment he'd looked at Emma and wished she had the mother she deserved. Every time he'd almost called but convinced himself he had no right. Isabel, I have spent 3 years and 8 months learning how to be the father Emma deserves, but I never stopped wanting to learn how to be the man you deserved, the man you could choose again, knowing everything that went wrong the first time. She stood too, the photographs fluttering to the table as she faced him. This close, she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell the familiar scent of his cologne, mixed with something new, something that smelled like home and safety and second chances. I'm scared, she admitted, the words barely above a whisper. So am I, he said, reaching up to touch her face with the gentleness of someone handling something precious and fragile. But Emma's right. Mrs. Chen is right. Sometimes the best families are the ones that break and then choose to heal together. Emma, who had been watching this exchange with the intensity of someone witnessing magic, suddenly scrambled down from her chair and wrapped her arms around both of their legs, creating a small circle of connection. Does this mean Dr. Bell is going to be my dragon lady forever? She asked, her voice muffled against their clothes but bright with hope. Isabel looked down at this extraordinary child who had somehow become the bridge between her past and her future, who had offered love with no conditions and forgiveness without even knowing there was anything to forgive. Yes, she said, the word coming out strong and sure and absolutely right. If you'll have me, Emma, I would love to be your dragon lady forever. Emma's cheer was loud enough to wake the entire neighborhood, but Isabel barely heard it because Alexander was kissing her, and it tasted like coffee and second chances and the kind of love that was strong enough to survive mistakes, patient enough to wait for healing, and brave enough to begin again. 6 months later, Alexander stood in the doorway of Emma's bedroom, watching Isabel braid their daughter's hair with the practiced ease of someone who had been doing it every morning since September. Their daughter. The phrase still made his heart stutter with gratitude and disbelief. Tell me the story about the dragon princess again, Emma requested, her voice sleepy despite the fact that it was 7:30 in the morning, and she'd already been awake for an hour, chattering about the school art show where her dragon painting would be displayed. Which dragon princess story? Isabel asked, her fingers gentle as they worked through Emma's dark hair. The one about the princess who could heal sick forest animals? Or the new one about the princess who learned to be brave? The real one, Emma said with the matter-of-fact tone she used when adults were being deliberately obtuse. About you and Daddy. Alexander felt his chest tighten with the same overwhelming love that hit him every time he witnessed these morning routines. Isabel had moved in gradually, a few nights a week at first, then longer stretches until one day in November, when Emma had asked why Dr. Bell didn't just live with them all the time since she was there every morning to make breakfast and every night to read bedtime stories. The transition hadn't been without its challenges. There were nights when Alexander woke up and couldn't believe Isabel was really there, mornings when she seemed surprised to find herself in his kitchen making coffee for 3 instead of 1. They'd had to learn each other all over again, not as the young couple who'd planned a perfect future, but as adults who'd been changed by loss and responsibility and the kind of love that insisted on surviving even when it seemed impossible. Well, Isabel said, securing Emma's braid with a purple hair tie, once upon a time there was a prince and a princess who loved each other very much, but they forgot how to talk to each other when things got scary. And they both made mistakes, Emma added helpfully, having heard various versions of this story enough times to know all the important plot points. Big mistakes, Isabel agreed. The kind of mistakes that broke their hearts and made them think they could never fix what they'd broken. Alexander moved into the room, settling on the edge of Emma's bed, to listen to this new version of their story. Isabel caught his eye and smiled, the same smile that had made him fall in love with her 7 years ago, but somehow deeper now, more knowing. But then what happened? Emma prompted, even though she knew the answer. Then the prince had a beautiful daughter who was wiser than both of them, Isabel continued, reaching over to touch Emma's cheek. And the daughter reminded them that love isn't about being perfect. It's about being present. It's about showing up every day, even when it's hard, even when you're scared, even when you've made mistakes before. And the dragon princess came back to the castle, Emma said, snuggling closer to Isabel with the contentment of a child whose world had expanded to include everything she'd been missing without knowing it. She came home, Isabel corrected softly, her eyes meeting Alexander's across their daughter's head, because she finally understood that home isn't a place. It's the people who love you enough to forgive your mistakes and brave enough to make new ones with you. Emma was quiet for a moment, processing this wisdom with the seriousness she applied to all important life lessons. Then she looked up at Alexander with those discerning hazel eyes that saw too much and understood even more. Daddy, are you going to ask Dr. Bell to marry you again? Because Mrs. Chen says you bought a ring and you've been carrying it around for 2 months like a nervous teenager. Alexander felt his face flush hot. Emma, sweetheart, that's supposed to be a surprise. I don't think it's much of a surprise anymore, Isabel said, laughing at his expression. Mrs. Chen told me too. She said you kept asking her opinion about the timing, and she finally told you that there's no perfect moment for perfect love, only perfect love for imperfect moments. Alexander stood up, his heart pounding with the same nervous energy he'd felt before their first date, before their first kiss, before their first proposal 4 years ago when they'd both been younger and more certain about their ability to control their future. This isn't how I planned this, he said, pulling the small velvet box from his pocket. I had a whole speech prepared. I was going to wait until after Emma's art show, maybe take you to dinner at that place on Newbury Street where we had our first date. Daddy, Emma said patiently, grown-ups always think they need fancy plans for important things. But the best things happen in pajamas with messy hair and morning breath. Isabel burst out laughing, a real laugh, full of joy and recognition, and the kind of happiness that came from being completely known by the people who mattered most. She's not wrong, she said, reaching up to touch Alexander's face. Our best moments have always been the unplanned ones. Alexander dropped to one knee beside Emma's bed, feeling ridiculous and perfect and more nervous than he'd ever been in any boardroom negotiation. Isabel Monroe, he said, his voice steady despite the chaos in his chest. I can't promise we won't make more mistakes. I can't promise it will always be easy, but I can promise that I will choose you every day and every moment for the rest of my life. Will you marry me? Will you marry us? The last part was new, an acknowledgement that any marriage now would be not just between two people, but the creation of a family that already existed in everything but legal definition. Yes, Isabel said, tears streaming down her face as she reached for the ring. Yes to you, yes to us, yes to Emma, yes to whatever beautiful mess we create together. Emma cheered and launched herself into both of their arms, creating a tangle of limbs and laughter and tears on her small bed. Does this mean we can have a wedding with a dragon cake? She asked, her voice muffled but excited. Absolutely, Alexander said, sliding the ring onto Isabel's finger. A different ring than before, simpler, more elegant, chosen with the wisdom that came from understanding that symbols were only as strong as the love they represented. And can Belle the dragon be the ring bearer? Of course, Isabel said, kissing Emma's forehead, and then Alexander's lips in a gesture that felt like sealing a promise that had taken 4 years to make properly. As they sat there in the morning light, holding each other in the bedroom of a little girl who had somehow become the miracle that brought them back together, Alexander realized that some stories didn't end the way you expected them to. Some stories broke your heart and then taught you how to put it back together stronger than before. Some stories, if you were very lucky and very brave, gave you exactly what you needed disguised as something you thought you'd lost forever. And sometimes, the most beautiful endings were really just beginnings wearing different clothes. 5 years later, the kitchen smelled like cinnamon and possibility. Isabel stood at the marble counter of their Beacon Hill home, watching 8-year-old Emma carefully measure flour into a mixing bowl, while her 5-year-old brother Oliver attempted to crack eggs with more enthusiasm than skill. The Sunday morning light streamed through windows that had witnessed so much, heartbreak and healing, endings and beginnings, the kind of love that learned how to be patient with its own imperfections. Mama Belle, Oliver got shell in the bowl again, Emma announced with the long-suffering patience of an older sister who had appointed herself supervisor of all kitchen activities. It's okay, sweetheart, Isabel said, fishing out the errant shell fragment. Shells happen, that's why we have backup eggs. She caught Alexander's eye over their children's heads. Yes, children, plural, because Oliver had arrived 2 years after their wedding, with Alexander's dark hair and Isabel's green eyes, and a personality that could best be described as hurricane with dimples. Alexander was leaning against the kitchen island, coffee mug in hand, watching their chaotic breakfast preparation with the expression of a man who had learned that the most beautiful moments were often the messiest ones. "Tell us the Dragon Princess story while we cook," Oliver demanded, his small hands sticky with egg whites and his face smudged with flour. "Which version?" Emma asked, rolling her eyes with 8-year-old sophistication. "The baby version? The middle version? Or the grown-up version?" "The true version," Oliver said seriously, unconsciously echoing the words his sister had spoken years ago in this same kitchen. Isabel began stirring the pancake batter, her wedding ring catching the light as she moved. The ring Alexander had given her 5 years ago, during that spontaneous proposal in Emma's bedroom, had been joined by a simple gold band during their wedding 6 months later, a ceremony held in the public garden where they'd once walked and planned a different future, with Emma as their flower girl and Belle the dragon as the unofficial ring-bearer. "Once upon a time," she began, her voice carrying the practiced rhythm of a story told countless times but never growing old, "there was a prince and a princess who thought love meant never making mistakes. But they were wrong," Emma added helpfully, now an expert in the family mythology. "Very wrong," Isabel agreed, "because the best kind of love isn't the kind that never breaks, it's the kind that learns how to heal." Alexander moved behind her, his arms wrapping around her waist as she cooked, a gesture so natural and frequent that the children barely noticed it anymore. But Isabel still felt her heart skip, still marveled at the simple miracle of being held by someone who had seen her at her worst and chosen to love her anyway. "And then the prince learned how to be a daddy," Oliver contributed, his version of the story always focusing on the parts that mattered most to him. "The best daddy in the whole world," Emma said loyally, grinning at Alexander, "even though he still burns grilled cheese when he gets distracted by work calls." "Hey," Alexander protested mildly, "I've gotten much better at the grilled cheese situation." "You have," Isabel agreed, leaning back against his chest. "You've gotten better at a lot of things." It was true. The man who had once tried to control every variable in his business and personal life had learned to embrace the beautiful chaos of a house with 2 children, a dog named Dragon, Emma's idea, and a wife who brought home stories about her pediatric patients that made him grateful for every ordinary moment of their extraordinary life. "What happened after the wedding?" Oliver asked, attempting to flip a pancake that was definitely not ready to be flipped. "After the wedding," Isabel said, gently helping him with the spatula, "the prince and princess learned that happily ever after doesn't mean easily ever after. It means choosing each other every day, even on the days when someone forgets to put the toilet seat down or leaves wet towels on the bathroom floor." "That's Daddy," Emma said with authority. "He's terrible with towels." "I'm standing right here," Alexander said, but he was laughing. "And it means celebrating the big moments and the small ones," Isabel continued, thinking of all the moments that had brought them to this Sunday morning. Emma's first day of school, Oliver's first steps, Alexander's decision to step back from some of his CEO duties to be more present for their family, her own choice to open a private practice that allowed her more flexibility with their children's schedules. "Like when Oliver learned to use the potty?" Emma asked. "Especially when Oliver learned to use the potty," Isabel confirmed solemnly. "That was a very big moment." Oliver beamed with pride at being the hero of any story, even a bathroom-related one. "But what about the sad parts?" Emma asked, her 8-year-old wisdom already understanding that real stories contained shadows along with the light. "What about when you and Daddy have fights, or when Grandma got sick, or when Belle the dragon got lost at the park?" Isabel met Alexander's eyes, seeing the same recognition there that she felt. Their daughter was old enough now to understand that love wasn't a fairy tale, that even the happiest families faced loss and difficulty in the daily challenge of being human together. "The sad parts are part of the story too," she said carefully. "They're the parts that teach us how strong love can be, how it can hold us up when we're scared or tired or missing people we've lost. Like how you held me when I cried about Belle the dragon," Emma said, remembering the great stuffed animal crisis of 2 summers ago. "And how Daddy held both of us when Grandma went to heaven," Oliver added, his 5-year-old understanding of death wrapped in the simple acceptance that came from being surrounded by people who answered his questions honestly and held him when the answers were sad. "Exactly," Alexander said, his voice rough with the emotion that still caught him sometimes when he thought about how close they'd come to missing all of this. These Sunday mornings, these sticky-fingered conversations, these moments when his children said things that reminded him that wisdom often came in small packages, with messy hair and endless questions. Emma, who had been unusually quiet while flipping pancakes, suddenly looked up at them with the serious expression that meant she was about to say something important. "I'm glad you guys made mistakes," she announced, "because if you hadn't broken up, you might not have learned how to love each other the right way, and then Oliver wouldn't be here, and we wouldn't have Dragon the dog, and Mama Belle might not be my real mama." The words hit Isabel like a physical force. Mama Belle. Emma had started calling her that shortly after the wedding, a title that somehow conveyed both her role as stepmother and her unique place in Emma's heart. It had made Isabel cry the first time she'd heard it, and it still made her throat tight with gratitude every time Emma said it. And besides, Emma continued with the matter-of-fact wisdom that continued to astonish the adults in her life. Mrs. Chen says the best stories are the ones where people have to work hard for their happy endings. She says that's how you know the happiness is real. Mrs. Chen, now in her 70s and still dispensing wisdom along with perfectly folded laundry and the world's best chicken soup, had become the grandmother figure their children adored, and the unofficial family philosopher whose observations had guided them through everything from teething to temper tantrums to the complex negotiations required when two strong-willed adults decided to build a life together. "Mrs. Chen is very wise," Isabel said, serving the first batch of pancakes onto plates decorated with cartoon dragons, a wedding gift from Emma that had somehow become their everyday dishes. "The wisest," Alexander agreed, settling into his chair at the breakfast table that had hosted so many conversations, so many ordinary moments that had slowly built into an extraordinary life. As they sat together, syrup-sticky and flour-dusted and completely content, Isabel looked around the table at her family. Her family. The word still made her heart race with gratitude. Emma, now 8 and wise beyond her years, who had somehow understood before any of them that love was about addition, not replacement. Oliver, 5 years old and convinced that he could fix anything with enough enthusiasm and the right tools. Alexander, who had learned that the best kind of strength was the kind that knew when to be gentle. And herself, no longer the woman who had walked away because she thought love should be perfect, but someone who had learned that perfect love was actually love that was strong enough to be imperfect. "You know what the real ending of the Dragon Princess story is?" she said, as they finished their breakfast, and the morning light shifted into the comfortable brightness of a day full of possibilities. "What?" both children asked in unison. "The real ending is that there is no ending. There are just new beginnings every single day and people who choose to meet them together." Emma nodded solemnly, as if this made perfect sense to her 8-year-old understanding of how the world worked. "So we get to keep writing the story?" Oliver asked. "Forever and ever," Isabel confirmed, reaching across the table to take Alexander's hand, their fingers interlacing with the easy familiarity of people who had learned to hold on to each other through everything life could offer. And in the golden light of that Sunday morning, surrounded by the beautiful chaos of pancakes and children, and the kind of love that had survived everything they could throw at it, Isabel realized that some stories didn't end with happily ever after. The best ones ended with "and their adventure continued," which was really just another way of saying that love, when it's real and patient and brave enough to try again, doesn't actually end at all. It just keeps beginning, one pancake-sticky Sunday morning at a time. What did you think of this story? Have you ever had to find the courage to love someone again after everything fell apart? Your participation in the channel is very important. Please leave your opinion in the comments. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed the story, please subscribe to our channel and leave a comment below letting us know what you thought. Your feedback and support mean a lot to us. Stay tuned for more exciting stories.